Thank you so much for that lovely intro, Nick. And I want to give a quick shout out to all of the amazing volunteers and organizers who have worked tirelessly to make this conference so safe and fun and unforgettable. Wow, this is weird, y'all. This is my first time speaking in person in so long since the pandemic. And I got really used to just sitting at home and not wearing pants. And now I'm on a stage and I'm still not wearing pants. But yeah, this is weird. But I'm so happy to be here with you all to talk about one of my favorite topics, designing ethically in tech. And before I get started, I just want to say, can you go back in time and just think about the very first moment in your life when you consciously realized that ethics was a thing, right? That there was right and wrong. For me, it happened when I was about 4 years old, which might have been a little late to the game, but I was super ready for dinner, showed up to the dining room table, really hangry, just like you probably all are right before lunch. And my dad asked me as I sat down, he was like, "So, did you wash your hands?" And like any 4-year-old who's too cool for hygiene, I lied, and I said, "Yeah." Hand washing. But yeah, I lied, and I got busted for that. I still have no idea how my parents saw right through that lie, but I'm so glad that they caught me and they taught me a lesson, and honestly, it's a good lesson to learn before the pandemic. So that brings me to today. Many years later, the topic of ethics has still been on my mind, and I think it's so cool when we can apply it to the fields that we're working in, namely tech and design. So a little bit about myself, which a lot of Nick already mentioned. I'm a designer at Spotify in Sweden, which I moved to about a year and a half ago from the US. And it was a new chapter of my life, a new place, and also started a lot of confusion for my parents. They thought I worked at Shopify in Switzerland for about 2 months. And I'm also the creator of Design Ethically, which I'll talk more about later on during this talk. And I'm also the mom to this rescue doggo that you see in the photo, and I miss him a lot. So if you haven't already seen Design Ethically, this is what it looks like, the homepage, and you can check out the URL in your own time, or not, because I'll be talking about it during this talk. So why ethics? Why ethics in tech? Why does it matter? Funnily enough, the tech industry got its first taste of ethics, or its first wake-up call, really, about in the same way that I did. We got into trouble again and again and again. We saw companies like Facebook and Uber and Amazon getting repeatedly called out for doing kind of shady practices. And that was when we kind of realized we need to get our shit together, pardon my French. So I've traveled the world a lot doing this design and ethics work, and I've met so many people, amazing folks in product teams and in policy and in academia. And I think what's really cool is that fundamentally, most people care. Most people really care about this. And oftentimes when I talk to them, what we kind of realize is that sometimes it feels like it's impossible, like the system is just so big, right? And oftentimes it's very easy to feel like you're just one wee person in the great abyss who just happens to be attending this conference. Not to get you in an existential mode while you're already hungry, but it does sometimes feel like that. And oftentimes we're like, well, yeah, we don't have that much impact, right? I maybe impact my close friends and family and my colleagues that I see every day. One of my former colleagues used to say, "I'm a designer, I'm an artisanal button maker," which he was totally joking, but sometimes it can definitely feel like that, and I resonate with that a lot myself. However, when we work in tech, we actually have so much of an impact. Working in tech is a privilege, 100%. It is a privilege to be able to make a tech salary. It's a privilege to be able to work from home remotely during a pandemic, even though you might not like it and you might hate the fact that your neighbor's been renovating his bathroom for 4 months straight, but it is a privilege. And with that, we have this privilege, and when we multiply it by the amount of technological diffusion that there is, just by virtue of our products being able to be spread throughout so many different platforms, so many different devices and in different locales, that leads to amplified power. And my question to you is, what are you going to do with that power? Who are you enabling? Who are you helping out in this whole system? So, how did we get here? Why is the system the way it is? Now, it helps for me to kind of look back and zoom out a little bit and see what drives us at each level, right? What incentivizes us? What drives us as people? And beyond that, what drives us as a product team? or as maybe a larger design organization, or even a company. And beyond that, the locale, right? What drives Silicon Valley versus the Swiss tech scene versus the Swedish tech scene, and beyond that, the industry itself. And finally, last but not least, what drives the overarching racial capitalist system in which we live? And that's a term that I borrowed from scholar Cedric Robinson, who really dedicated his life to studying how our systems of extraction and exploitation are so closely intertwined with our racial categorization that we've constructed. So the thing that kind of ties that all together is this one word that you hear all the time in our industry. It's the sexiest word of the tech industry for the past few years. We have job titles named after it. We have company divisions named after it. And it's growth, right? Everyone's talking about growth. You're a growth designer. You're a growth VP. You're on the growth team. And that makes you wonder, growth at what cost, right? The sad truth is that in order to survive in today's tech industry, especially in Silicon Valley, but also elsewhere, companies have to ruthlessly design for growth. And that probably doesn't sound that odd to you, but if you think about it a little further, it gets a little bit worrisome. Our pursuit of growth is so baked into our industry that we not only regularly lobby against regulation, but we also have incorporated growth practices in our everyday processes, and we've normalized them. So this is your just generic product cycle zoomed out at like 1,000 feet. You probably do something like this at your own company or on your own team, and maybe you call it something else. I typically refer to them as like OKRs, objectives and key results. And in a team, you typically choose those OKRs in the beginning of the quarter, and they can be something like, oh, I want to reduce the percentage of canceled subscriptions, or I want to increase the number of people that sign up for this app. And then you choose those, and you work throughout the quarter to tweak the product, to do user testing and whatnot, to get to that OKR, or those OKRs. And that's nothing, right? Nothing new, nothing revolutionary. We're all used to that. That's how we work. But what gets a little tricky and dicey is when you think about how much that impacts our own performance as employees, right? Our ability to get promoted, our ability to get raises, oftentimes is either directly or indirectly tied to OKR fulfillment or growth fulfillment or helping the company's bottom line. And when I say that, it sounds so obvious. Like, of course, that's how companies work, duh. But when you think about it a little further, right, what does that incentivize us to do? What will we design and create in order to achieve those things? What's the limit there, right? And we've got things as simple and innocent as nudging, or maybe using gamification to get our users to do something, right? Okay. And then if you go even further down that rabbit hole, you have actual anti-patterns, or you might have heard of them as dark patterns. And we've all been on the receiving end of an anti-pattern, right? If you've ever really struggled to cancel a subscription, you know how frustrating that is. It's so annoying. It's really frustrating. And that happens all the time. And these practices are so normalized in our industry that we not only teach them at universities, in design boot camps and whatever, we also just regularly use them in our companies day to day. So how do we incorporate ethics into our design practice as designers? It helps to kind of realize what ethics is and what it isn't. So ethics is not necessarily law, right? There's plenty of things that have been legal and are currently still legal that were never ethical to begin with. Nor is it necessarily religion or societal norms, right? If you look at it from an academic perspective, a lot of philosophers, ethicists have spent their whole lives trying to see and understand what's good and what's bad and what's in between. And that's kind of the study of ethics, as nebulous as that sounds. What helps for me, though, is to kind of figure out some common values that are really important to uphold within whichever context we're in. There's so many values out there. I've picked 3 that I think really speak to the tech industry and to us as designers. And also, I love dogs, lots of dogs in my presentation. But the first one is autonomy. And autonomy simply means that you feel like you're in control of the product that you're using, and not the other way around. You never want to feel like the product's in control of you, and that can be really scary. Imagine how annoying that would be like on an app like Facebook, but how terrifying that would be in an autonomous vehicle, right? The next big thing is transparency. Transparency means that you know what you're signing up for when you make a WhatsApp account. You know who's getting your data. Transparency means that if I'm making an AI system, that it has a sufficient level of explainability so that other people know how it works, so it's not a black box. Transparency means that if I'm going to be an Uber or a Lyft driver, I can understand what's getting factored into my paycheck and what's being taken out of it. And last but not least, safety. This is not just physical safety, it's also emotional safety, right? Mental health is so important to us. And safety means that we don't have to feel like we're being excluded from a particular product or a platform based on whatever. And it also means that we don't feel like we're being targeted from a particular product or being surveilled based off of any kind of categorization, right? So these things are really key, I think, to kind of hold near and dear to our hearts. And I think fundamentally what kind of ties them together is choice, right? We want to give users choices to enable their autonomy. We want to make things transparent for them so they can make the right choice for themselves. And we want to ensure safety regardless of what choices they or other users make. And it reminds me of this really great quote that I love by bell hooks, the author. Being oppressed means the absence of choices. As designers, how are we building this kind of choice giving into our products, right? It's not to say we have to give users every choice in the world. I don't want to log into Instagram and have to choose what color the logo is. I don't really care about that. But I would like to choose whether or not Facebook's able to show me targeted ads based off of my ethnic affinity, which is something they did in the past, and they got into trouble for that. So now that we've kind of identified some values, let's look at some schools of thought of living your best life. And there's so many schools of thought in ethics, especially in not only the Western canon, but also the Eastern canon as well. I'm going to look at two from the Western schools. One of them is called deontology, and then that's just a fancy $5 word for living your life based on the intent, right? It's an intent-based framework, doing the right thing because it's the right thing to do. And the second one is consequentialism, otherwise known as utilitarianism, results-based. You might have heard of the greatest amount of good for the greatest number of people. And these two, I think we can apply to the way that we design and build products. So if you look at this intent and result paradigm, on the first side, we have to think and ask ourselves, is this problem a worthy problem to solve? Not all apps need to be built, right? If someone comes to you and says, hey, can you make an app for me that basically steals everyone's money around me, would you do it? Maybe, no, you wouldn't. You really shouldn't. And that's something we have to keep in mind. And on the results side, what consequences does our solution have? Now, there are a lot of products out there that claim to have great intentions, but had really bad results. Like Facebook saying, oh, we just wanted to connect the world, but we didn't realize we'd be completely undermining democracy. Like, that is never an excuse, right? The impact or the results matter more. And so that's just something to keep in our heads. And what I did was actually map this paradigm onto our design process. And so here you see just a generic design process that you might recognize. It's from the Stanford D School. There's so many variations of this. A lot of companies have their own version. My previous company had the IBM Loop. You might have heard of the double diamond method. But this is just your generic go-to first thing that shows up when you Google design process. And as you can see, I've put the first two steps under the intent side and the last three under the result side. So under intent, you see empathize. We have to understand our users, get to know them in order to define a particular pain point or problem that we want to solve. And then we move over to the result side where we ideate solutions, we prototype them, and then we test them out. And this has worked time and time again, but I was wondering, is there a way to kind of incorporate more steps that explicitly have us thinking about the ethical consequences that we're putting out there? So I added some steps, more work for all of us. And the first step that I added was evaluating and kind of going to that original question. Is this problem a worthy problem to solve? And after you've figured out, okay, yes, it's worth my time to dedicate energy to this and effort to this, you ideate and you forecast on the solutions that you've come up with, right? And forecasting simply is asking yourself, can any ethical violation occur if we implement this particular idea? And what are they? And after you've done that, you can prototype and test out your solution, ship it out to the world, and then before you forget about it and go home, you have to monitor. And it's so easy, as someone who's worked in the tech scene for a while too, it's so easy to go on to the next cool, fun, exciting thing after you finish and ship a product. But it really does matter to kind of return back to that original product and ask yourselves, is anything coming up that we didn't see beforehand? Are there any new ethical issues that we have to readdress? And so I want to spend a really quick second talking about my favorite step, forecasting. It sounds hard, but I guarantee you that you all have done it at some point. You're all probably doing it right now as you think about what you're going to eat for lunch, or if you've watched a TV show and you're trying to guess what's going to happen in the last season. And you might be really good at it, or you might be pretty bad at it like me, and that I watched all of Game of Thrones and had no idea the last season was going to be that bad. But we all do it at some point, right? And what really stood out to me about this for forecasting was that I kept on seeing all these articles and headlines that had these two phrases, and it really bothered me. It rubbed me the wrong way. Unintended consequences and unforeseen consequences. And I want to kind of sit with that for a little bit. Unintended, maybe, sure. But unforeseen, that feels like a cop-out. That feels like someone didn't do their homework. Feels like maybe they didn't care to do their homework. So these two phrases bugged me a lot, and I think that we need to be better about addressing them and focusing on how we can proactively forecast, right? So forecasting, as I was saying, sounds hard. You do it all the time, though. You really do. And the whole thing about forecasting is that it's one of those rare things where it's not about quality over quantity, it's the other way around. You're trying to cast a wide net and trying to find all the different edge cases, the worst possible scenarios, and you proactively plan around those. And so in your toolkit, you already have a lot of things that you might already recognize, right? Like sociology and future studies and whatnot. My two favorite are actually introspection and intuition. As I've been doing these workshops with folks, I've come to realize that a lot of people leave and they're like, I actually learned a lot about myself during this whole experience. Because you have to reflect a lot. And so if you care, you can always check out Design Ethically. There's a toolkit section where I've got a couple activities for your teams. When I do workshops, I will go through these activities with folks just to kind of give them a lay of the land. And some folks ask me, okay, well, if I forecast something bad, does that mean I should just never make it? Not necessarily, right? If that was the case, we'd never have anything get created in our world, right? Pineapple on pizza would not exist. But what I think about this is that, sure, there are some problems that you should not address, right? Like that app that steals money from people. Shouldn't make it. But oftentimes, forecasted consequences are simply design problems that we have to look at and tackle. And there's new challenges that we have to solve before we ship the product. So, looking ahead, what can we do? What can we do and bring to the table as an industry and as just employees in the tech industry? So, I want to show you this picture. It gives me chills every time I see it. You might recognize this, you might not, but this was from November of 2018, and this is in San Francisco. It was the Google walkouts. And these did not just happen in San Francisco, they happened in a variety of cities where they had Google offices. Employees at Google got frustrated because there were a series of high-up employees that got accused of sexual harassment, and they got off scotch-free. In fact, some of them actually got really generous severance packages, which was annoying and horrible. And so people obviously were incredibly angered by this, and they walked out. And it just speaks to the fact that we do have unprecedented power, not just in the technologies that we make, right? But as people, with our tools that we've made, we have new ways to organize, new ways to unionize, new ways to spread awareness and get people fired up about things that are not working in our system. And we have to leverage that. So how do we scale and mature this design ethics movement? And I call it a movement because that's what it is, right? Design ethics should never just be one lonely chief ethics officer sitting up in their ivory tower, nor should it be a handful of really loud people on Twitter, right? Design ethics is you and me. It's people with their boots on the ground who are building these products day by day. How can we enact this grassroots change? So as an industry, a couple things we can do. We can ensure that our schools and programs teach ethics, right, instead of anti-patterns. We can overhaul the metrics that we use to gauge our performance. So not having it be just about growth in the bottom line, looking at other ways that we can measure success. and also creating a new pipeline for a diverse and inclusive workforce. If you have a homogenous team, you're going to create a homogenous experience. And right now, our pipeline is broken, especially in the US, it's really broken. So how can we make a new one? As a company, what we can do is we can upskill our workforce, right? Teaching people, training people in thinking about these aspects. We can also conduct ethical audits via third-party review boards. And finally, we can grant amnesty to workers. Now, this one's a bit touchy, but it means a lot to me because, in the past year and a half, we've seen a lot of organizing at big tech companies, Google, Amazon, you name it. And unfortunately, we've also seen a lot of these organizers get and face retaliation, whether they're getting fired like that or facing punishment at work or whatever. And that, to me, is such a shame. It is such a shame, especially when you think about that a lot of the folks that were speaking up were people that were already marginalized in our tech industry. They were Black employees, they were trans employees, and they were putting their jobs on the line. And I personally think that when you have the courage to speak up about something that's wrong in your company, that means you care about the company so much that you're doing that. And I feel like that's why amnesty should be granted to them, because they care that much. As an individual, what can we do? There's a lot of things that we can learn and unlearn, right? We grow up and we absorb all of these different biases. How do we unlearn those and let those go, right? And also, how can we learn about people that don't look like us or people all over the world? How can we define our values? Defining your values, figuring out what matters to you, what is important to you, because that will give you the moral backbone to be able to say no. And I hope that you have never been put in a position or never will be put in a position where you have to make something you don't want to make or it's something that goes against your philosophy. But chances are you'll be asked to do that at some point in your life. And I hope you have that courage to say, no, I don't want to do this. And I just want to share a quote by one of my role models, Grace Lee Boggs. She was an American activist, and she said that in order to transform the world, we have to transform ourselves. And so what does that entail? What does that process look like? And just wanted to end off with another lovely image of a dog struggling here, because this sums up how I feel about it all. It's hard. It's really, really difficult. But nothing ever worth doing was easy. And so with that, I wanted to say, in this whole scenario, nobody is neutral, and doing nothing is neutral. We all have a chance to do something, whether that's just to speak to our employees, our colleagues, or start a petition, or do whatever you can to move the needle a little bit more in the direction of justice. So with that, thank you all. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Kat, for that inspiring message. Now it's time for the question and answer.
Yeah.
Okay, so I have one question I'll start with. It's stirring the pot a little bit. How would you respond to people who say you're being naive to say we can prioritize ethics and still be competitive as a business?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I think that it's challenging, right, to prioritize business, and oftentimes, as we've seen, they directly conflict. And what I think we need to do is to actually address the larger question at hand, which is that the system of neoliberal capitalism that we're in within the tech industry is not helping any of us out. It's not helping the environment out. It's not helping us out as people. It's very extractive and exploitative. And maybe there isn't a way to completely, have these two goals of business needs and ethical practices coincide together. And that's something that we have to reconcile with, and we have to create legislation that protects the most marginalized. So yeah.
Thank you. What do you think needs to happen to encourage broader mainstream adoption of ethical design frameworks and practices within the field of design?
Yeah, so I think it's a multi-pronged approach. I think it doesn't just come from us, although a large part of it does come from the individual folks on these teams. It also comes from tech leadership. It also comes from working with people in policy, right? Working with them, because oftentimes, especially in the US, these policy folks don't necessarily have a tech background. and working with people in academia to kind of ensure that they're teaching practices that can be more conducive and helpful for our whole society. So yeah.
Thank you. Is anybody currently writing a question on Slido? Raise your hand. Okay. As we don't have any more questions. If anybody has like a spontaneous question, I know I'm not allowed to do this, but if you have a spontaneous quick question, just yell it out. Okay. Okay, let's give a big hand for Kat Zhou.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Kat.